Now, my next guest this evening is Kevin Courtney, who was Joint General Secretary of the National Education Union at the time of the pandemic. He says schools had no choice but to close as the virus was rife and it would have been unsafe to keep them open. Kevin joins me now. Thank you for joining us.
Pleased to be here.
The teachers' unions were amongst the most strident, weren't they, in their calls for the schools to close, even when other voices said they should open. How do you look back on that now?
Well, you make decisions in the light of the information you've got, the science that you understand at the time. So I look back on it and I think that we made the right calls. I do need to say the schools were never closed, completely closed, because they were always open to key worker children and vulnerable children at every period. But there were long periods of closure. It was always government that closed them, but we were advocating at some of those points for that partial closure.
Why so determined? You know, when there were, you say the science, and there were other voices, including the government, saying the schools, should open generally. And yet the teachers' unions were determined otherwise.
I mean, for example, in January 2021, we were calling for schools to close. Boris Johnson on a Sunday night said the schools were open. We were saying they should close. The next day, he changed his mind and said the schools should close. He did that, I think, because of the evidence from SAGE. We looked at the SAGE minutes. That's where we were getting our position from. And SAGE was saying that if the schools were fully open, that there was no way the R rate that we used to talk about all the time, we've forgotten what it means, but the R rate would be above 1. The virus would be exponentially growing. Now, it wasn't, and this is difficult to say, it wasn't that children were particularly at risk. By January 21, we knew that the risks went up with age and with, if you had diabetes, you were at risk, etc. So SAGE was saying the schools had to be closed to protect other people, to protect the vulnerable parents, the vulnerable grandparents of the children in schools, the vulnerable parents and vulnerable grandparents of the teachers in the schools. And we thought SAGE were right. So we were going with the bulk of scientific thought on the matter.
Molly, how do you feel listening to that? You were all about opening the schools, reopening the schools, and you were looking at the same data and listening to what SAGE were saying. How do you respond to what Kevin's saying?
Look, I do have considerable sympathy, actually, for that argument, and I do understand that at the time there was a real perception that adults, perhaps all of them, perhaps a subset, were in real danger. I think there are a few things I'd say to that. I think it seems that the risk from COVID, many of us might accept now that was rather overinflated. I don't blame the teaching unions for that. I've put the blame of that squarely at the door of government. I think at the same time, the harms of school closures were either downplayed or perhaps not taken into account in the way they could have been. So you talk a lot about the SAGE papers and the R rate, and we heard so much about that, all those charts. It's a very deliberate, propagandised fear environment that we all were asked to live under. We never heard really the equivalent about the other side of the equation, the harms to children. And I don't just mean learning loss. I mean, what happens to children when you shut down childhood? Often asking them to be in environments which we sadly now know are unsafe. What happens to children when you put them in front of screens, when you move their whole lives to phones? And I think had we maybe balanced that, we may have come to a different conclusion.
Kevin, listening to that, and how do you feel now? I'm in a kind of reflective mood this evening, and looking back across all of the years, what do you feel about what you must have seen has been distilled about long-term, possibly permanent harm caused to the youngest?
I mean, I've got two reactions to what Molly's just said. First, to question Molly about whether she really thinks that COVID wasn't a risk. I mean, do you mean now that we've got the vaccination, it's not a risk? Because we had two colleagues in my work who died of COVID before vaccination. They died of it, and they were not of an advanced stage, but they did have other conditions, and they died of it. It is a serious illness. But I absolutely agree that closing schools does have huge consequences, and they're not good consequences. And and it's if you're a disadvantaged child, the consequences are worse. I mean, if you're at home and you've got a nice private garden and you've got your own bedroom and you've got your own iPad, then that's very different to being in a 5th floor flat and no space whatsoever. I think the consequences have been bad for children. And our government should have been doing more to make sure the school closures should be as short as possible. Our school closures were longer than many other countries. During the pandemic, I spoke to my opposite number in the Danish teacher union. They had some school closures, but they were shorter. But the reason they were shorter, we talked this through for some time with my colleague Mary Bousted, with our colleague. Their class sizes were smaller, their space standards were better, they had better ventilation in their classrooms, so it was more possible to have the school open without the virus spreading. But we were looking at the ONS statistics, which showed that when the schools were open, the level of COVID amongst the children was going up week by week by week. When the schools closed, it started to fall again. And this is the hard thing. It wasn't to protect the children. It was to protect their parents, their vulnerable brother and sister, their vulnerable grandparents, and we now owe it to those kids. The government should have been investing far more in recovery, and that's not just education recovery, it's social recovery for those children.
So, look, I mean, I absolutely agree with you on the last point. I think in terms of your question about, how dangerous the virus was, I would say the sad and probably quite uncomfortable reality here is that for the vast majority of healthy people, it was not a serious threat. That is not to say there are not many adults for whom it was a very serious threat. But what we did is we asked healthy young people, including children, all of them, to bear a burden that I would say was never theirs to bear. We asked them to overcompensate for the ill health of the adult population, and I think that morally is wrong.
Kevin, is there regret? Is there regret in the industry? And I would always have preferred to think of teaching as amongst those professions that's a calling as well, that there's a pastoral care that you would expect from the people who go into that profession. And do you get any sense of there being a commitment that if something similar happens again, that the teachers and the teachers' unions would stand up to make sure that the mistakes made in the past are not repeated? Or not?
I mean, there's all sorts of things that I regret about that period, but I regret that we couldn't get the government to listen to us. There were times when we were advocating we thought that when it came to a choice, do you open pubs or schools? They opened pubs. They did eat out to help out. They kept and schools being. It wasn't at that precise time, but if there's a choice, then I'd be in favour of schools being open, other things being closed to keep the R rate below 1. We were trying to get the government to invest in an education plan B during the pandemic to have more spaces with children and adults with them, safe-checked adults, so you could have more spaces open, the R rate would be a bit lower. We were advocating, for example, there were a number of sixth form colleges that managed to make a very effective, not perfect by any means, but children were in 1 week, at home the next. And half the class was in, half the class was at home, half of them were learning online, half of them were in, and by doing that situation, they managed to, their R rate didn't go up, in that their rate of COVID growth seemed to be lower in their institutions. I think we need to look at all those mechanisms, because no teacher would want schools to be closed. You want to find the ways around it.
I feel, I mean, I'm going to run out of time, but I just feel that we're looking back on a national tragedy, a national scandal, and a national disgrace. That children, the youngest, everything should be done to protect them, and yet they were made to bear the brunt of the hurt. They took the biggest hit, and I think as a society we should look back on that and find that inexcusable.